In this video, we're going to study the difference between insert reverb and auxiliary reverb. This is a sort of crucial point when it comes to gluing mixes together. Both of these approaches to adding reverb to your mixes can be valuable, but we're going to just understand a sort of subtle difference between them so that you can apply what you've learnt to your own mixes, choosing sort of the right decision for whatever your mix requirements are. So within this piece, what we've got is a very simple arrangement for just 4 instruments, and these are pizzicato strings. I'm using the Vienna Symphonic Library dimension strings, and the reason I've chosen those samples is because they're incredibly dry. There is no reverb attached to these sounds at the moment at all, so you'll hear just how dry they are as we listen through the piece. Okay, so that's working fine, but it sounds unnatural, and the reason it sounds unnatural is because if you were going to go and hear this piece performed by ensemble groups of this size, this number of violins, violas and cellos, there's no way that the space in which you were listening to those sounds wouldn't impact into the sound as well. They're completely reverb free at the moment, but if we were going to go and hear this performance at a concert hall or in a cathedral or anywhere else, the sound of that space would become part indelibly of the actual sort of performance itself. So we certainly need to add some reverb to these sounds for it to sound remotely realistic. So let's look at the way that most people would attempt to do that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to select all 4 channels within the mixer strip. I'm going to select an auxiliary bus. I'm going to turn up the auxiliary sends from all 4 sounds, and over here what I'm going to do is to go and find a reverb, something sort of like a hall feels like it might be kind of appropriate. I'm going to use the lexicon hall reverb. I might choose a large hall, and let's just see what we get with that. Okay, and that's instantly sounding a little bit more familiar. I haven't even sort of, apart from adjusting a little bit of reverb time, I've touched almost nothing in terms of the capability of what this this plugin can do. But nevertheless, immediately we've got a sound which is familiar. But it's worth bearing in mind that if I mute the return channel and press play, we're back to where we started. And the reason I've done that is to make one very simple point, which is that if I add auxiliary reverb, I still have all of the dry sound completely untouched, and then I have a reverb channel on top. So just as it's relevant to mute the auxiliary return, if I was to solo it, it demonstrates the point just as well. This is just the reverb and no dry sound at all. Okay, so what I've done there is to demonstrate that it's possible, mixing this way with auxiliaries and channels such as we have them right now, to effectively see these two things as completely separate things. We've got all of the dry sound and the reverb, whereas actually if we were going to go and hear these strings playing back in a space, we'd never have that separation, these 2 separate channels. We wouldn't have the dry sound and the wet sound glued on top. And so for some applications, instead of working with an auxiliary reverb, let's just turn all those sends down for a moment so that they're effectively not happening, and mute the return channel. What makes more sense is to work with an inserted reverb. So in other words, a reverb that is existing between the dry sound and the output, so that effectively what you're in a position to do is to shape a particular reverb as a blend between the dry sound and the wet. Now I'm reaching for a different reverb. I could of course continue working with the Lex Hall, or what I can do instead is to set up the sort of size of space that I'm working with before. So let's go and select a really long sort of or large space, and then let's just trim the decay rate. So I've still got all of the properties of a large space, but maybe with a 3-second reverb. This time, of course, I'm at the moment only working with the first violins. I could select the kind of character I want that sound to have. I'm going to go for something sort of brightish, but I want to be quite a long way away from it. And then I want a nice sort of spacious treatment here. And then, of course, I've got the all-important mix dial. If I solo this sound, what we're now going to have is a similar thing that we had with the reverb, the Lex Hall reverb, and a moment ago, where we only had wet signal. But what I can do as I trim the mix dial back down is I can set a blend between the dry signal and the wet. So now what I've got is a space which feels a little bit more natural. I've got no sort of sense of a completely dry signal and a wet signal operating as separate entities. So of course what I could then do would be to come out of solo mode. I could instead just simply copy this setting across all 4 channels so that I've got the same reverb applied to all 4 sounds as inserts this time. And that way we don't get quite the same sense of those 2 separate channels operating independently. Now, the only thing to bear in mind is it matters which of these approaches you choose depending on where you are at the mix stage. In other words, if you're choosing to add a reverb quite late in the process, you're sort of coming to this and you're suddenly thinking, okay, this collection of sounds would sound better with a reverb, it's worth bearing in mind that suddenly these sounds are sharing a volume balance between the loud, dry original sound and a much quieter reverb sound. Because the sounds are set further away, of course, they're going to be a little bit quieter. And as a result, let's just compare the volume with and without reverb. If I look and play through this mix, we've just played it through with the wet channels, and we can see that, for example, this first violin part peaks at minus 11 decibels. Let's see how loud it is without any insert reverb. Okay, so it's at -9. So effectively, by apportioning some of this sound to a reverb channel, we're losing 2 dBs worth of volume. And of course that matters because if we add an insert reverb to a mix which is already established, particularly one which is already using volume automation, then of course that part is going to feel like it's lost some volume and some energy. So you might need to compensate that by either trimming your volume or adding volume to that automation, or simply by adding a gain stage. So these two separate approaches to working with reverb in this way really matter. Whether we're working with inserts to sort of split a signal and add reverb at source, or whether or not we're working with auxiliaries to add reverb as this sort of separate channel at the end.